Let's bring it home to Canberra now. Joining us live for a bit of reaction onto what's happened in Washington, DC. Senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, good to see you. Thanks for your time this morning. So let's start off with some of those announcements out of DC. In the past couple of days, the increased military presence, as Annalise just pointed to there, increased marine rotations, involving all forms of defence as well. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a very positive step, and I think it's a timely one. You're seeing a growth of Chinese power and assertiveness in the region, and so it's quite natural for the US and Australia to work together to respond to that. And one of the logical things that we can do as an ally of the US is to allow the US to operate more extensively from Australian bases. So I think bringing additional US forces in on rotations, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines on a regular basis is an important step for us to do.
What about the comments from the Secretary of Defence and also the Secretary of State yesterday with almost a guarantee that Australia will not have a capability gap that comes to our subs? How are you reading into that? Are you buying it?
I can't work out how we're going to avoid one because the Collins are becoming increasingly obsolete. They're going to go through an upgrade, but even so, that's going to leave these submarines as quite old in comparison to what the Chinese are developing. We won't get the first nuclear submarine until the late 2030s. Now, unless they have some sort of scheme whereby we're going to somehow lease or purchase second-hand US nuclear submarines early, I can't see how we're going to avoid that capability gap. So clearly they've got something in mind which they're not sharing with the general public, and I'll be very interested to see how they're going to square this particular circle.
I mean, because if there are new submarines perhaps coming online, then the Americans would prioritise those for themselves, wouldn't they? So that just forces us further down the pecking order.
It does. The Americans have their own strategic needs. They've only got two shipyards to build submarines. I mean, one of the options that has been considered is that Australia chips in for building a third US shipyard so that the Americans can build nuclear submarines faster. That may be one viable solution. But I don't see the Americans giving us brand new nuclear submarines immediately. I think it's going to be a case of we have to wait until we can get one.
What about Japan's increased involvement now, Malcolm? It's funny how times change in 80 years. Good to see.
Absolutely. Japan is a vital ally and partner of Australia. I think it's an increasingly important one that we need to be strengthening that relationship. There's a question in terms of whether Japan should be brought into AUKUS in some way. And I think these are all positive steps. So it's great to see Japan having a greater role, including greater access to operating from Australian facilities.
Yeah, and no doubt that'll ruffle China's feathers. Speaking of which, those COVID restrictions have relaxed in some part in China. We've been running that story this morning. Malcolm, what does this say in your view about Xi Jinping's thought process at the moment and his future leadership?
Look, I think the odd protest in some Chinese town is one thing. But nationwide protests that are large-scale and highly visible is quite another. And I think that probably Xi and the Chinese Communist Party felt that if they did not ease up a bit, then this could morph into something far more substantial along the lines of the Tiananmen Square protests. And that would be a direct challenge to the Chinese Communist Party's rule. From the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, only one thing matters, and that is their grip on power. And so therefore they're doing what they need to do to maintain that grip on power.
Even if it is just a slight tweak of the rules?
Essentially, and I would fully expect the Chinese security organs to go in and start arresting people behind the scenes. So, this is not indicative of some sort of reform or democratization in China.
Right.
This is essentially a necessary step by the Chinese Communist Party to maintain their grip on power.
For its own survival.